Hi, welcome back to another podcast with Mr. Hagan. On this podcast, we're going to look at actual statutory and actual incidents again, and this time we're going to look at it from the point of view of the consumer. That is to say, what if we put the statutory incidents on the consumer instead of putting it on the producer? So I've already done some videos where we put the statutory incidence on the producer or the supplier. That shifted the supply curve up by the amount of the tax. Okay, so we already did that, but now what we're going to do is we're going to look at what if we put the statutory incidence on the consumer instead? What if we put the statutory incidence on the consumer, on the demander? And what that would do is that will shift the demand curve down by the amount of the tax. So the demand curve is going to shift down by the amount of the tax. So right here is going to be that vertical shift is going to be equal to the amount of the tax right there. So let's go through this and see what it would look like. So first, the demand curve, right here it is, shifts down by the amount of the tax, and so what's going to happen as a result? This is if we, what does this look like? By the way, if I put a statutory incidence on the demander, what this looks like is maybe a consumer maybe goes to the store to buy a product. Maybe they got to buy some hand towels or something, and they go to buy their hand towels, and when they go to pay. They do not pay the tax right there in the store. Instead, they just pay for the towels, and then they have the statutory incidence. They have the legal obligation to go home and write a check to the government. That's what it means for the statutory incidence to be on the demander. They have the legal obligation of actually mailing the money into the taxing authority and into the government. And so what will happen is the demand curve then will shift down by the amount of the tax. All right, and so the first thing that will happen is that will reduce the price of the product because consumers are going to demand less of it, and so there's going to be a new equilibrium when the demand curve shifts down. There's going to be a new equilibrium point, and that's going to create a new price P2, and it's also going to reduce the quantity that is sold and purchased, that is traded in the market, and that Q2, just like it was before, that's going to be the new tax base. The number of units being taxed is going to decline from Q1 to Q2. So that's what it looks like. Okay, so let's put some numbers on it, like I did in the previous podcast when we put the statutory incidence on the supplier. With the statutory incidence on the demander, let's say that the tax is equal to $6 per unit. Then when the price, maybe the original price was P1 $100, and now the price is going to, because the demand curve shifted down by the amount of the tax, the price of the product is going to fall from $100 down to P2, which let's say is $97. Okay, so if the price goes down to $97, all right, let's think again about what all of this means. The price goes down to $97. So it used to be that the consumer paid $100 for the product and they got the product, and that was it. It was finished. But now they pay $97 for the product, but they have to go home and mail $6 into the government. So the total amount that they pay is $103. They paid $97 at the store, but then they had to mail $6 tax into the government, getting up to $103. And so this distance right here between the two demand curves, that distance is the amount of the tax. In my example here, it's $6, and so $97 go up to the old demand curve and over, and that adds on the tax, which gets us to $103. So the consumer used to just pay $100, got the product, went home, done. Now they pay $97, mail a $6 tax into the government, so the total they end up paying with the tax is $103. What's it look like for the producer? For the producer, they used to get paid $100 and they kept $100. Now they get paid $97 and they keep $97. So they'll get paid less than they did before. Okay, so the tax is this vertical distance I just said that. That's the vertical distance. Any vertical distance between the two demand curves is going to be equal to the amount of the tax. Well, right here is one of those between 97 and 103 between P2 and P3. That's going to be the vertical distance, which is equal to the amount of the tax. Now, the consumers, as I said, the consumers are going to pay part of the tax in the form of mailing in the tax. That's where I said they paid $97 for the product, but then they had to mail $6 into the government. That was their statutory incidence. So they pay part of the tax in the form of, they used to pay $100 total, now they pay $103 total for the product. And then producers pay part of the tax in the form of getting a lower price. They used to pay $100 and now they only pay $97. So they're going to get a lower price for the good than they did before. So again, the statutory incidence being on the consumer doesn't really change anything. It's still going to be the consumer pays part of the tax and the producer pays part of the tax. Okay, so it doesn't really matter who gets the statutory incidence. The actual incidences are going to stay the same. And so let's take a look at those actual incidences. The consumer actual incidence is going to be just the exact same place it was when we put the statutory incidence on the supplier. I did that on a previous video. Doesn't matter. Consumer actual incidence is going to be right here in this rectangle. Why? Because the consumer used to pay $100 for the product. Now they pay $97 plus the tax. The total they end up paying with the tax is $103. So they pay $3 more for the product total than they did before, multiplied by the number of units that they buy. That's going to give you the consumer actual incidence. And then the producer actual incidence, that's going to be the lower rectangle. Why? Because they used to get paid $100 for the good. Now they only get paid $97. So they get $3 less than they used to, multiplied by Q2, the number of units that trade in the market, the number of units that they sell, and that gives you this rectangle right here, which is the producer actual incidence. Okay, so the consumer actual incidence is going to be from P3 to P1. The producer actual incidence is going to be from P1 down to P2. Okay, same thing as when the statutory incidence was on the supplier. Everything's the same. And then the government revenue. So we have the consumer actual incidence, the producer actual incidence. The government revenue is going to be these two added together. It's the consumer plus producer actual incidence, which means it's going to be this entire box. Okay, it's going to be the entire box. And that's not surprising because it's the amount of the tax, which is P2 to P3 down to P2, multiplied by the number of units that sell in the market, and then we got a rectangle here, and that's going to be the amount of the revenue collected by the government. Okay, then we also have to talk about the deadweight loss, because again, it used to be that the consumers bought Q1 units of the good. Now they're only going to buy Q2 units of the good, and that's going to be a loss to both the producer and the consumer, because this area right here, this used to be consumer surplus, and now it's going to just disappear. This is going to be, did I just say that wrong? This used to be consumer surplus. I'm not sure if I said that wrong. This used to be consumer surplus, and now it's going to disappear. And this used to be right here. This used to be producer surplus, and now it's just going to disappear, this lower triangle. And notice this, that between Q2 and Q1, from Q2 to Q1, the benefits on the demand curve were above the costs on the supply curve. So the benefits were greater than the costs, but it never happens from Q2 to Q1. Those additional units, they never get traded because of the tax. And so that's exactly our deadweight loss. And then finally, we're left with the consumer and producer surplus. Hopefully you can read this. This says consumer surplus, and then this says producer surplus. The consumer surplus right here, the consumer surplus used to be the big triangle. Used to be that big triangle above the price and below the demand curve, but now part of the consumer surplus is going to go to the government, or it's just going to disappear because of deadweight loss, and so we'll end up with the consumer surplus of this smaller triangle right here. That's going to be your consumer surplus. And then the producer surplus, that used to be below the price and above the supply curve. That was the producer surplus before the tax, but because of the tax, some of the the producer surplus is going to go to the government, some of it's just going to disappear to deadweight loss, and so the producer surplus now is going to be this lower triangle down here. That's going to be the producer surplus. Now the big story here is it doesn't matter who gets statutory incidence. If you go back and you watch my videos where I put the statutory incidence on the supplier, all of this looked the same. It doesn't matter if you put the statutory incidence on the supplier or the consumer or the demander. It doesn't matter. The consumer surplus, the consumer actual incidence, producer actual incidence, producer surplus, deadweight loss will all be the same. It doesn't matter on whom the tax is placed. It doesn't matter who gets statutory incidence. The actual incidences will be the same. Okay? We'll talk more about this idea of actual incidences in another video. We just said what really doesn't matter here is who gets statutory incidence. That's really not a big deal. But what does matter is the elasticity of these curves. That's what's going to affect the actual incidence, the elasticity of the curves. We'll talk about that on some future videos. All right, this has been Mr. Hagan on another podcast. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you on the next Econ podcast.